Lovely. Yeah, so thanks, Eleanor, very much for the introduction. So today, essentially, you'll be kind of uh, a brief overview of essentially what the space environment entails. Obviously, we all have this concept of what space is in our heads, but actually, when we break it down into what are the constraints of that environment, it can sometimes be quite different to understand. And then there's a huge sort of spectrum of medical challenges that the space environment brings. And I'll really sort of focus on three aspects of physiology that is affected in astronauts during space flight. And I'll hopefully pass on a bit of information about what we do to sort of help those astronauts. And then finally, I'll cover a brief section about what are some sort of current and upcoming opportunities that UK medical students might be able to take part in, should you sort of want to go away and find out a bit more. So hopefully the video will work. So astronauts essentially spend years and years preparing and training to work effectively in space. But what they're heading to is an environment that we cannot in any shape or form effectively replicate on Earth. Sometimes we can replicate small aspects of it, but in reality, it is something that can only be experienced once you go to space. It's an environment completely alien to us, and don't worry, that pun isn't lost upon me. So it's an environment that's both operationally challenging to work within, but it's also detrimental to their health. And as medical professionals, or soon to be medical professionals, our job is essentially to aim to mitigate those challenges. But first, let's actually understand what that environment is. So the obvious thing that we like to talk about is microgravity, or the lack of gravity. So this completely changes the way in which humans interact with their surroundings. All of a sudden, once you're in space, your entire concept of orientation is completely altered. Without gravity, nothing is instinctively up or down. Dropping items no longer result on them hitting the floor, and without any external forces, gases don't convect, and particles like dust don't sediment onto the surface below them. And this can be quite a disorientating experience for an astronaut. Secondly, they're entering an environment that's got a background radiation that's sort of nothing like what we experience on Earth. Background galactic cosmic radiation and radiation from our nearest star, the Sun, is largely deflected around Earth's magnetic field and absorbed by layers of the Earth's atmosphere. In space, this level of protection is either lessened or is just not there at all, depending on how far away from Earth you're going. So how do we protect our astronauts from the damage that radiation can cause? And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. And then the famous Earthrise image just really sort of shows that actually there's a huge psychological factor to being isolated in space with what is usually a multinational, multicultural team, and you're completely remote from civilization in what is a very high-risk, dangerous situation. And whilst many astronauts maintain that this similar sort of Earthrise image, being able to look back and view Earth, view your home, is a way to remain connected to Earth and psychologically beneficial, then how does this change as we plan missions to Mars, where Earth is simply just a speck in space that is unnoticeable? And then there's the spacecraft itself. So this is an image through the center of the International Space Station, and factors such as the lighting, the temperature, the composition of gas within that environment and also any sort of toxins that could leak out into that environment. And then the risk of things like micrometeorites that can damage your craft, the risk of fire, and many more can all affect human health, whether organically or psychologically. So now that we've sort of looked a little bit at what the space environment looks like, let's move on to some of the specifics, physiological challenges that this presents. So I'll start by talking about the cardiovascular system. So we've evolved over millennia to work in a 9.81 meters per second squared, i.e. 1g Earth's gravity. And we're evolved to do that mostly in a standing position. But actually we're fairly badly evolved for this. If you think of the concept of your brain is your boss, and no matter what, survival is reliant on your brain being perfused, getting enough oxygen and getting enough glucose. But for some reason we've evolved that our brain remains 20 centimeters roughly above our heart, which means that the heart has to work really hard actually, and has had to develop some quite clever mechanisms in order to keep that brain perfused. Just as a note, dogs generally are much better adapted for this than we are. They keep about 70% of their blood volume at or above their heart, whereas we keep about 70% of ours below it. At least we're not giraffes. So usually from our head to our toes, our intravascular system has a hydrostatic pressure gradient. It has a pressure caused by gravity exerting itself, meaning that pressure is higher in your feet and lower in your head. And as we sort of stand up out of bed to create this pressure gradient, around about half a litre of blood can actually flow from our thorax and into our lower body. And therefore, if you remember back to sort of your basic physiology and talking about things like the baroreceptor reflex, we increase our heart rates to compensate for that. But what if you're in somewhere where gravity doesn't exist and that process simply cannot happen? You can't alter the distribution of bodily fluids in your intravascular space. So shortly after an astronaut reaches orbit, and therefore they reach microgravity, and I say microgravity because there's never technically no gravity, but it's such a minimal amount of gravity it may as well be. The hydrostatic pressure gradient, so that pressure of water in a column, is equalized across the whole body because there's no effect of gravity to pull that blood into the legs. On Earth, we try and replicate this in experiments by making people lie in bed for long periods of time, and we tend to tilt them to about a 6-degree angle so that their head is slightly below their feet. And therefore that allows sort of the blood pressures to equalize in the intravascular space. But because of this sort of equalization of blood across the whole body, astronauts then develop this quite sort of typical puffy face appearance. So if with an eye of good faith you look at the astronauts in the top and then look at them again in space on the Mir station below, you can see that their faces are much fuller and are sort of engorged with blood. That's not because they haven't got the gravity to pull it into their feet that they normally would have on Earth. Similarly, because of that, everyone's legs get a bit skinnier in space, and this has the affectionate name of puffy face chicken leg syndrome. And what happens because of that? Because they've got all this extra blood sort of within their thorax, within their head, the body detects that as having too much blood volume, because on Earth, if you were to have that, that's what it would reflect. And therefore, in the initial stages in space, astronauts tend to urinate a lot. They have a diuresis to get rid of all that, so they actually have a reduced blood volume. What that means is over time, that the heart generally has to work less hard because they're not having to work against this gravity gradient in order to perfuse their brain. And also because there's no sort of getting up from chairs, getting out of bed, there's no activation really of their baroreceptor reflex. So over time, the heart deconditions and the reflex becomes desensitized. And whilst in space, this doesn't really seem to cause any particular challenge for the astronauts. But when they return to Earth, it can be quite a different matter. So I'll just play you this clip, and please excuse the caption from the YouTube video.
The preparation we had training the team inside life.
How you feeling? How you feeling?
Boy, if that's not a little embarrassing. But, so I don't get people worried standing up here too long. I think what I was going to say, and so I figure I could stand here standing enough. It's a training enough.
So that was astronaut Heidi Marie Stefansson Piper speaking at her welcome home ceremony after returning from space. So in her case, what has happened is that as she stood up, her blood pressure drops as it does for any of us on Earth. But she, because her baroreceptor reflex is desensitized, she doesn't have a sufficient compensatory increase in her heart rate. And therefore, over time, her brain becomes not perfused as it should be. And therefore, in order for her body to correct that and to perfuse her brain, she essentially faints. And it's a problem that affects about 20% of astronauts who go on short duration flights, and about 85% of astronauts who are in space for long durations, so sort of 6 to 12 months. So imagine if you're an astronaut who's first landing on Mars. On those initial steps of landing on Mars, you'd be expected to probably perform what is mission critical and probably life essential tasks upon landing. So if you're unable to maintain your consciousness and work for prolonged periods of time upright, then actually it could be quite a detrimental factor that could essentially put an entire mission of someone's life at risk. If you combine that with the fact that astronauts could be at an increased risk of bone fractures following mild trauma, which I'll go into a little bit more about later, then you create a perfect storm in which for injuries to happen. So what can we actually do to help prevent events like the one we just watched? So astronauts currently on the International Space Station have a series of countermeasures to help maintain their heart health in order to sort of help improve this transition back to Earth's gravity. So the device you can see on the left is known as CVIS, which is Cycle Ergometer and Vibration Isolation System, i.e. it's just a fancy name for a bicycle. And then on the right, there's the T2 treadmill. And both of these sort of obviously cardiovascular based exercises help to maintain that sort of increased blood volume, which helps with the orthostatic intolerance, but also increases maximal oxygen uptake and offers other psychological benefits. There's also ARED, which is the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, which if you sort of tilt your head to the right, you might recognize a little bit more familiar is looking a bit like a squat machine. And whilst it's predominantly used for sort of resistive strength-based exercise, the increased pressure loads put enough stress on the heart to help maintain cardiac mass. There's devices like Shebis, which is a lower body negative pressure device, which is predominantly used by the Russian space program. And essentially it looks something like, if you've ever seen Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers, it looks like The Wrong Trousers. And essentially the purpose of this device is you step into it, it's like a very sort of rigid set of trousers, and you seal it tight around your abdomen. And then what they do is they suck out some of the air to help create a vacuum, which essentially helps to draw fluid back into your legs from the central circulation, similarly in a way that you would do if you were to stand from a lying down position. And therefore it puts that pressure on the heart and stimulates that baroreceptor reflex. It's not usually used throughout an entire mission, but it's used to help condition astronauts before they return back to Earth. Astronauts as well, both US and Russian and European astronauts, will tend to sort of try and load up on fluid and salts before returning back to Earth. So essentially it's a standardized protocol whereby they have increasingly greater intake of salt and water in the days leading up to returning back to Earth to help increase that intravascular volume. And then there's anti-G suits. So two types have previously been used in the space program. The one on the left is the Space Shuttle Launch Entry Suit, which contains an anti-G suit similar to what you might expect a fighter pilot to wear. And essentially it contains inflatable bladders around the legs and the abdomen that help to squeeze fluid from them back into the torso. And on the right is the Kentaver suit, which is worn before re-entry, and it's used to again compress that lower body like an anti-G suit, and it helps to prevent blood pooling in the legs on re-exposure to gravity. And both of these can help prevent orthostatic intolerance by helping to keep that blood volume more intrathoracic than sort of in the extremities. So that's a little brief overview of the cardiovascular challenge that space presents. Next, let's move on to the musculoskeletal challenge. So as a reminder, bone is essentially a mineralized collagenous structure, and it's arranged in terms of cortical or hard bone on the outside with a honeycomb-like trabecular bone on the inside. Now, a lot of people instinctively think that bone is this simple, dead tissue that's just used as a structure to help move around and for other structures such as muscles to attach to. What we need to remember is actually bone is a very active tissue that is constantly turning over. Bone is being constantly remade and destroyed, and it's highly sensitive to the environment it's in. And one key factor that it is sensitive to is the mechanical stress which is placed upon it. So this diagram is commonly known as sort of the Frost mechanostat. And essentially what it is that bone has this physiological area of stress that whereby bone creation is met equally by bone destruction. When we move into overuse, then that is the area whereby bone production is greater than bone destruction. So this is sort of the area that you might expect someone to be in if they were just starting to exercise, doing things like squats and deadlifts and putting a lot of extra weight stress on their bones. If you move beyond that, then you move into pathological overload, and this is where we talk about stresses that are likely to cause fractures and damage. But if we go the other way and look at disuse, then actually we see that bone destruction outmatches bone creation, and we start to actually lose bone mass. So obviously the standard stressor that is constant essentially on Earth is gravity. And without it, astronauts can lose bone mass at about a rate of 1 to 1.5% per month, which if we compare that to sort of what we see on Earth, so if we think of our typical sort of category of osteoporosis patient in hospital, so that the classic example is your postmenopausal women, their bone loss tends to be about 3 to 5% per year. So obviously astronauts are losing this bone mass at such a greater rate than even they are. But this bone mass loss doesn't occur equally across the whole body. So if we look at this diagram, essentially it's a summary of what percentage of bone mass is gained or lost at certain parts of the body. And during spaceflight, bone is mainly lost from load-bearing areas. So if we think of the calcaneus or the heel and a place like the greater trochanter in the hip, they're the areas that are exposed to the most loads when we are walking around on Earth. And therefore the areas that then lose the greatest amount of activity when an astronaut goes into space. But these are also some of the areas that are at the greatest risk of fracture when we think about our osteoporosis patients. You know, if we think about the femoral neck, how commonly do we see NOF fractures within hospital? And then that bone has to go somewhere. So the summary of this graph is as we move from left to right, so as we move through essentially increasing number of days in space, we see that actually urinary calcium excretion increases throughout that flight. And this isn't just an academic curiosity by itself that we can sort of note and be happy about. So November 11th, 1982, Valentin Lebedev, which is the gentleman on the right, finds his crewmate, Anatoly Berezovsky, on the left, writhing in pain one day on the Salyut 7 space station. Fortunately for him, the pain self-resolved, but it's very likely that Anatoly developed a kidney stone, which he then passed. Now, whilst this sort of ended with a happy ending, imagine if this were to happen in an astronaut who's on a trip to Mars with absolutely no possibility of evacuation to Earth and no real way to treat that kidney stone if it can't be naturally passed itself. Essentially, you're talking about possibly a life-threatening and a mission-threatening incident. But gravity isn't the only factor that in space which can affect your bone, and this is sort of a testament to the difficulties of space research, is that there are so many confounding factors to whatever we want to look at. So if you can imagine you're spending your entire time in a tin can and having no natural UV exposure, then that will translate into a lower level of vitamin D, which we know is very important for maintaining bone health. And therefore, having lower vitamin D increases your rate of bone resorption or bone destruction. Additionally, a multitude of dietary factors can also affect bone health. And in an environment in space where nutrition is tightly controlled and it's not freely available, being able to provide sufficient nutrition to maintain bone health can be quite a challenge. On Earth, carbon dioxide makes up approximately 0.03% of the air we breathe. But in an enclosed environment such as a space station, or even something like a submarine, levels can rise to up to 1%. This affects our acid-base balance, which has a secondary effect on blood tending to increase our bone resorption. as the calcium and the phosphate helps to act as a buffer in the blood. And then finally, we can look at how individual genetics can also play a large part in this response. And across the astronaut population, we see huge differences in how much bone each astronaut does lose. And it's not just the bones that are affected. Muscle loss is more confined to areas which are required to maintain upright posture in a gravity environment. Predominantly, that translates to the deep muscles within the back and muscles within the legs, whereas muscles of the upper limb and chest tend to be unaffected, or even sometimes they increase in muscle mass due to the sort of the different way that astronauts move within a microgravity environment. And as we can see, the amount of muscle that an astronaut can lose can be quite considerable in some areas, up to 20% loss after a long duration flight, and that's even with countermeasures in place. So as I mentioned before, if you imagine the fact that when you return to Earth, you're much weaker, your bones are much more fragile, and you're much more likely to faint, all this is sort of the perfect storm for an astronaut to fall and have a fracture. And again, as that is less of a problem on Earth, although not desirable, it would be devastating to happen somewhere much more remote like Mars. So again, what can we do about it? So I've already mentioned the exercise device that can be used to help maintain muscle mass and provide some stress factor to the bones, particularly in the lower limb. But then what about medications? So at the moment, we don't know a lot about how beneficial the use of medication is in space. Things like Adcal-D3 and alendronic acid that we regularly give to our osteoporotic patients may be of benefit to astronauts, but particularly alendronic acid, it's not the easiest medication to take. You often have to take it 30 minutes before food. You have to remain upright for that 30 minutes and is associated with a lot of side effects. Obviously, the process of being upright isn't even feasible in space. But then look into the future. So what we're seeing here is a short arm centrifuge that essentially can spin a person round and create a gravity vector. The one here in particular, you can also combine with exercise devices. So the one at the bottom is a cycle, the one on the top left is essentially a squat machine that you could do whilst having a gravity vector. But obviously being able to have this sort of equipment in space is a huge engineering feat, and actually launching it into orbit is very difficult. And then of course you could always look at, can we create artificial gravity? Could we have a spinning spacecraft that would create that gravity vector for us? But again, like with the short arm centrifuge, it is a huge engineering challenge that we don't even know if it's feasible yet. So then moving on to our third challenge, the radiation challenge. So firstly, let's look at why is radiation such a problem? And particularly when we talk about this, we're talking about ionizing radiation. So it's all to do with DNA. So radiation can strike DNA directly and cause damage to DNA. But alternatively, it can interact with water within our cells, and it can break it apart into free radical molecules, which can then either directly damage DNA themselves, or they can combine with oxygen to create superoxide and peroxides, which also can damage DNA. The result, as I've said, is DNA damage, which can either not be repaired and results in cell death, or it can be repaired which can sometimes work, sometimes fail, or it can lead to mutations. And essentially, when we talk about mutations, we're then talking about the risk of cancer in the future. It's also worth noting that this effect of cell death due to ionizing radiation is also a possible confounding factor when we look at cardiovascular deconditioning, muscle and bone loss. So what is different about the sources of radiation in space? So the image you're looking at right now are of what we call the Van Allen belts. These are essentially zones of highly charged particles, mostly electrons, that are held around the Earth by its magnetic field. We essentially have an inner belt and an outer belt, and sometimes a third one, but that's less relevant. And the inner belt begins at an altitude of about 1,000 kilometers above sea level. Just for reference, the International Space Station is at around 400 kilometers. So this is mainly a concern for missions beyond low Earth orbit, whether that be to the Moon or to Mars. However, sometimes the inner belt can come as close to Earth as 200 kilometers, so it has some small relevance, but generally we don't tend to worry about it. In terms of the actual mission constructs of a space flight, these belts have thinner and thicker parts, and therefore we try and plan launches to allow the traverse of the Van Allen belts to occur at the thinnest parts and therefore the lowest radiation doses. Moving on, the one we particularly worry about, and especially for astronauts operating outside of the space station, so on a spacewalk or what we call extravehicular activity, as these are solar particle events. These are huge ejections from our own sun that deliver large amounts of radiation. The doses of radiation we're talking about are enough to cause acute radiation sickness and death. So if we think of some of the higher ones that have been recorded, fortunately when astronauts haven't sort of been in space, they're at the levels where we would expect death to occur. And then there's the background galactic cosmic radiation. This is essentially the background radiation that exists in all parts of space, and is thought to be sort of the effect of distant supernova. Now, this is the radiation that differs massively from what we see on Earth, because what it contains is very high energy, high mass particles. So these are things like protons, all the way up to iron ions. And what they are, so they travel essentially in straight lines very fast, and the more energy these particles have, essentially the more damage that they can do. And generally, because they travel at such high speeds, they're very difficult to shield against. And we're lucky on Earth in that our magnetic field deflects most of it from us. So to get an idea of sort of what levels of radiation are occurring here, so if we look at a chest X-ray that we do for a patient, that is 0.0001 sievert of radiation, whereas a solar particle event can be up to 5 sieverts. And at 5 sieverts, we tend to expect about 90% mortality within 6 weeks of that exposure acutely. Now, interestingly, radiotherapy doses can be much higher, but it's important to remember that those doses are targeted at very small areas and aren't whole body exposures like what we see with solar particle events. So therefore, radiotherapy wouldn't have the same effects on things like the central nervous system and the bone marrow. And then when we look at galactic cosmic radiation, that tends to contribute about half a sievert a year. Now, when we look at what the dose limits are for a career astronaut, depending on their age, we can see that actually if we were planning a Mars mission that would take around 3 years to complete, then you're potentially talking that that could exceed the dose limit for that astronaut simply by being on one mission. Now, these dose limits are set at around a 3% lifetime increased risk of inducing cancer. So as you can imagine, that's quite an increased risk for an astronaut to be taking already. And if they were to go to Mars, would they be happy possibly accepting a larger risk? And ethically, as medical professionals, could we allow that? So what can we do about it? So largely, it's an engineering problem. How do we shield our astronauts? Now, part of the problem, again, with this galactic cosmic radiation, because it travels at such high energies, it itself can interact with the spacecraft materials and cause secondary radiation that can be even more damaging than what the high energy particle itself could have been. Now, there are suggestions of things like active shielding. So could we actually have something like a superconductor on a spacecraft that would generate a magnetic field of its own and help deflect away some of this radiation? Additionally, materials such as water is a fantastic way to shield against this kind of radiation. But again, in an environment where it costs thousands of pounds to even send 1 kilo of material into space, can we even send up enough water to sufficiently shield a spacecraft? So moving on to what opportunities exist within the UK space sector for UK medical students specifically. So as of 2016, we actually have a specialty training pathway for aviation and space medicine. It's the newest specialty under the GMC, and essentially it involves, after completing ACCS or GP or core medical or core anesthetic training, you can go into a 4-year program to train as a consultant in aviation and space medicine. Now, I won't dwell on that too long because obviously that's much further down, but it's worth being aware about if you ever thought you might want to work in this specialty in the future. So sort of more relevant for where you are now, ESA, the European Space Agency, they run usually once or twice a year a human space physiology course that is aimed at students. So it's a 4-day course. It's usually held in Belgium or Germany, and it's open to any BSc or MSc student studying medicine, allied healthcare, life, biomedical or biological sciences. And it's essentially an intensive 4-day introduction into sort of the physiology and life in space, and going into a bit more depth about the things I've talked about, plus much more. But they'll also cover about Earth-based analogues and how we actually try and study some of these effects on Earth, things like bed rest studies. And then they talk much more about the countermeasures specifically for microgravity. There's also the International Space University, which is based in France. And every year they tend to run a 9-week program throughout the summer. It's a multidisciplinary program that covers all aspects of space, everything from space science and engineering all the way through to sort of human performance and medicine and space policy. And it's 9 weeks of intensive lectures, workshops and visits. Essentially, it's a very expensive course to do. I won't kid you about that. But usually, the last time I checked, the UK Space Agency offers some very good grants that help cover the costs of something like this. And you'll find that if you go to any space conference, huge numbers of people will have attended this program. It tends to take place in a different place every year. So the 2019 one was in Strasbourg in France, and I know previous ones have occurred in Israel, in Ireland, and other places around the world, and upcoming ones are in China. And then there's ESA internships. So Spaceship EAC, or Spaceship European Astronaut Centre, is the program in which interns support activities in the 7 areas listed below. And ones of interest to sort of medical professionals may not be initially obvious from their titles, but many include a medical slant. The multidisciplinary nature of these projects are purposely broad. Examples of sort of medical ones that I've known about have included looking at 3D printing of medical equipment, things like needles and needle holders, or the design of exercise equipment and techniques to counteract muscle atrophy on the moon and other long duration missions. Alternatively, internships can occur in the Space Medicine Office specifically, and might be a good option for an elective. And they tend to focus on sort of analysing a bit of medical sort of research data and performing literature reviews. But because of the highly confidential nature of the work, doesn't include any clinical experience with the astronauts. And if that was something you sort of want to look at, they do tend to offer some funding for their non-resident interns, and you'll receive an allowance of around €600 per month to help support you taking part in that project. So I can't really do a talk without mentioning the Austrian Space Forum. As it was mentioned earlier, I do work for them as one of their analog astronauts. And essentially they're an organisation of professional volunteers who perform simulated Mars missions around about a month long in sort of space-like environments that we can find here on Earth. So if you compare the images here of the desert in Oman and Mars, you can see that actually there is a lot of similarities in how that landscape looks. So essentially, they developed a spacesuit simulator which allows for high fidelity simulation of spacewalk activities. And the way that their missions are constructed is that over the month they will perform research experiments on behalf of principal investigators from other institutions, all whilst using analog astronauts within their spacesuit simulator in order to sort of test how well their experiment will function in a sort of Mars or Moon-like environment. Whilst it's not primarily a medical research body, past missions have included medical research. Examples include analysis of physical and mental fatigue in analog astronauts, analysis of verbal communication to identify psychological or physiological maladaptation in extreme environments. Again, looking at 3D printing of medical instruments, and long-term medical monitoring using biomedical data. In addition to the sort of the research opportunities, there's a whole background of personnel that make these missions happen, and that includes medical personnel. So if you ever wanted to become involved with analog research, they're an excellent organisation to approach, and I'll include their website address towards the end. I'm very proud to say that the biomedical team there is sort of predominantly British. That's never been intentional, but I'm kind of slightly proud to say it. And then a recent opportunity that I found out that sort of would be very relevant is the University of Colorado are offering a virtual medical student elective in space medicine, where you would undertake a project analysing some aspect of human spaceflight factors and medical risk. So if the dates happen to line up with when you're due to do your elective, then it might be something very worthwhile applying to see if you could be part of. And then there are many other organisations that hold space events or space talks where you can go and find out more. So on the top left is the Royal Aeronautical Society, who are based in London. They're predominantly aviation based, but a lot of their work does extend into the space sector. And every year they hold essentially a one-day conference, sort of specifically focused on a part of human spaceflight, which you have to pay to go to, but then also at the end they always hold a free award-giving lecture that is very good to attend if you happen to be in London. The institution on the top right, the Aerospace Medical Association, is an American organization that purely focuses on the aerospace sector, and they hold a huge sort of 5-day conference every year that if you're ever sort of lucky enough to get out to, is a great meet and greet opportunity. And again, they offer sort of lots of grants and competitions for submitting abstracts that can help sort of fund you getting to those conferences. On the bottom left is World Extreme Medicine, who are becoming sort of very well known for holding some fantastic courses and lectures and a brilliant conference every year in Edinburgh. And they're getting an increasingly strong presence of space subjects within their remit. And then on the bottom right, there is a sub-part of an organization called ESCAC. They have a Space Medicine and Life Sciences project group, who are much more focused on the sort of student or newly qualified bracket, and that they hold a number of sort of webinars every year. And right now they're hosting a systematic review project to allow students and sort of newly qualified doctors and researchers to get involved with doing a systematic review in a space related topic. So whilst it's a bit too late to apply for this year's, they are hoping to continue it in further years. So if that was something you'd like to get involved with, then please keep an eye out for that opportunity. And generally, all these opportunities, the best way I find to find out about any of them and keep linked in with what's going on is to follow the organizations on Twitter. I think I found out about 50% of all opportunities I get involved with must come through Twitter, if not more. And then the web address for the Austrian Space Forum that I alluded to earlier is www.oewf.org. And if you want it in English rather than German, then /en/. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks very much for joining me. I kind of hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all learned a little something and sort of feel a bit more inspired to find out a bit more. I'm happy to sort of take some questions for however long now. And if you wouldn't mind following the link at the bottom and providing some feedback on the talk, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think with the feedback form, I think it might still be in editing mode.
Oh, right.
So,
okay, I'll fix that.
But yeah, if everyone could try filling that in, that would be great. And I will post it on the event afterwards. And if people do fill that in, and then if you screenshot the bit that says that you filled it in, and then send it to the BSMS email, then we'll send you a certificate for attending the event. So that's a little extra motivation to fill it in. So Ewan is asking, as a particularly average, I'm sure this is being modest, 5th-year medical student, how competitive is getting into the specialty, do you think?
To be honest, I don't think it's a particularly competitive field to get into. I just think you need to be very passionate and excited about it, and just to be keen to learn. It's a niche enough field that many people haven't heard of it. And it's just a kind of a great nerdy field to hang out in, because everyone just absolutely loves it. I can tell you for sure at med school, I certainly was nowhere near the top. I came out at 8th decile in my medical school, and you know, I'm doing sort of pretty well. So I wouldn't worry about if you feel you're an average student.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think probably more than your decile, it's probably all the extracurricular activities and stuff show your passion for the field, isn't it?
Sure.
Anna's asking, what would a qualified doctor actually do if they were to get involved in space medicine, both research and clinical work?
So there's sort of multiple parts to that. So if you were someone who specifically wanted to do aviation and space medicine, as if in the formal GMC specialty, it is predominantly aviation based, because obviously within the UK that is where the bulk of the work is, and you spend a lot of time doing research. So I would say if you were someone wanting to go into that specialty, then do it because you're interested in research, and you know, don't go in there expecting to do 100% of your work within the space sector. Now, if your aspirations were more to be a flight surgeon at somewhere like the European Space Agency, then you don't need to be within the formal UK aviation and space medicine specialty to do that. Most people tend to come from either one of the ACCS specialties, so either acute medicine, emergency medicine, anesthetics, or intensive care medicine, or they tend to come more from a GP background. In terms of the research and getting involved as a student, again, systematic reviews are a really good thing to get involved with, and places that have you know, space like research going on. I would say try and expand it beyond just space, but look at what's interrelated. So look at, you know, things like altitude and diving, just because the amount of research bodies is much greater in those areas. And just try and get involved with any research study you can. You know, feel free to email an academic and just see if they've got anything they need help with. Generally, you know, like it being such a small field, everyone within it tends to be sort of very friendly and welcoming to anyone who's wanting to get involved.
Tom has asked, when did you decide that this was the career path that you wanted to take, and what led you to that decision?
This is a little bit of a story. So I decided it must have been 2015, so I was just coming towards the end of my undergraduate degree. To provide a bit of context, I'd applied for medicine in sixth form and didn't get in, and I'd applied for medicine again at the end of the undergrad and didn't get in. So I was having a bit of a panic about, oh God, what do I do now? You know, I've kind of failed to get in what I want to do twice. And inevitably I applied for loads of things during that BSc, and you know, I was applying to lots of master's degrees, and you know, I had a fairly generic personal statement that, you know, I was kind of putting a new application together. It didn't take very long, and I knew there was sort of things going on with altitude, and you know, I enjoy mountaineering, so I thought, oh, maybe something like that will be good. And some random Googling essentially come across this space physiology and health masters. So I put together a CV and I sent it off and kind of completely forgot about it. And then a couple of months later, I got an email asking for an interview. I thought, oh God, I haven't even read the prospectus. I need to sort of actually find out what this course is about. And got offered a place on the course and just thought, well, I'm going to do it. This just sounds far too exciting to not do. And I just absolutely fell in love with it at that point, and have tried to sort of get it as involved as I can since.
Thanks for that. So Nikita has asked, as a third year medical student, in terms of ways to explore this specialty, do you think attending conferences is the best opportunity to go for?
So I would say, as a third year student, I would say the best opportunity you could do is try and get on the ESA space physiology course that I alluded to earlier. That is just going to give you such a good grounding and introduction to the field. Attending conferences is useful, but I would say someone particularly, you know, in the third year of med school, just getting that foundation built up, and you know, listening into webinars, and if you can, try and get involved with some research. I don't know if you're someone who's sort of considering intercalating at all, but you know, if you can get a project that's got any sort of space or even sort of a whole body physiology sort of element to it that is applicable to space, then that would be really good.
Elizabeth has asked, with the deconditioning of the heart in space, is there something astronauts, like the one in the video, recover from well? If not, does this then affect their ability to go on a second space mission?
So fortunately, with the cardiovascular element of it, astronauts do tend to fully recover. When they first return to Earth, there's a sort of a couple of weeks to month process of progressively training their bodies back into normal life, essentially. The same can't really be said for the bone loss element of it. We tend to find astronauts never quite recover the same level of bone, even sort of 5 days down the line. And it's a big question that we have actually when we look at astronauts going to Mars is, do they continue to lose bone constantly until they have a pathological fracture? Or do they just find a new happy medium that their bones sit at and are happy to be at least until they're reintroduced to gravity? So time will tell on that aspect.
George has asked, are there a set of sites or hospitals that you'd be working at if you go down the route of space medicine as a specialty and not just any hospital?
So current trainees in aviation and space medicine, so from what I know, about 50% of them work in the Royal Air Force. That obviously seems quite logical in that you've got a large pool of pilots to work with. But then the other half that work within the civilian sector, all the curriculum is managed through one training deanery, but you tend to need a company to sponsor you, so someone like British Airways, who you can work for, and will sort of pay your wage.
Next question is, are there job prospects or opportunities for doctors to get involved in space medicine within the UK Space Agency or any commercial space companies?
So unfortunately not. As far as I'm aware, the UK Space Agency themselves don't have medical personnel. They're much more sort of a policy setting board than an active space program. Obviously, UK doctors are very able to get involved with the European Space Agency program, as we are a member state. And I'll just point out that EU and European Space Agency aren't related. So because we're leaving the EU, we're not leaving ESA. And then within the private space company sector, again, unfortunately, a lot of them are US based, and generally US based space programs are only open to US citizens. And the reason being is that their divide between military and civilian isn't sort of as strict as what it is in Europe. And then in terms of opportunities for doctors within the European Space Agency, there are more opportunities than simply being a flight surgeon, you know, working with the astronauts day to day. There are things like the ESA Concordia station, which is an Antarctic station that sits at altitude, that always has a doctor on base. And there's people like Beth Healy, who you can find on Twitter, who was a UK doctor who did that a few years ago. And that's a good way to, you know, to get involved with some, you know, extreme medicine practice, but also some space-related research.
Someone's asked about, do you know when the next ESA space physiology course will take place? I think the most recent one is in October, and they hope to do another one before June. I think they're yearly, as far as I know.
Yeah, so they tend to be yearly. Traditionally, I think it would usually happen in the March, but to be honest, with, you know, the current environment and COVID and stuff, I don't honestly know when the next one will be for sure.